Just going to wait another few moments to make sure that everyone who wants to join us is able to do so. But thank you for coming on. Good to see you all. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're delighted to be together tonight. I'm sorry for the confusion about days, but because tomorrow night is Yom HaShoah, we have a very special program with Karen Perlmutter, who's going to be presenting a film that she created with her father about her father's story as a survivor of the Holocaust. And next week is Yom HaAtzmaut. So we've moved tonight to Tuesday and next week to Tuesday, and then we'll resume with our Wednesday conversation. So I hope that doesn't cause anyone any distress, but we're really good to have, it's good to have everybody here together. Thank you for coming on. This is an extraordinary week in the life of the Jewish people. And I want to mark all of the events of this week because I think it's really very important that we gather these events together. We just finished the holiday of Passover. And the last image of Passover, the Torah reading that we read on Saturday morning, which is the last reading of the Torah. The next day is actually an additional day. But the Torah reading that's read on Saturday is the 15th chapter of the book of Exodus. It's the story of the crossing of the Red Sea. That is the image, the quintessential image of the Passover. We were slaves, our parents were slaves, their parents were slaves, and their parents were slaves. And we had no hope of being anything or our children having any fate other than to be slaves like we were. And suddenly out of nowhere comes this man, Moses, and says to us, pack your things, we're leaving. According to the Midrash, 4/5 of us wouldn't believe him. 80% of the Jews were skeptical. But a few of us believed him, and we began to pack. And he said, get ready to go because we're not going to have any time. When it's time to go, we're going to run. You're not going to have time to let the bread rise. I just need you to run. And when he came back and said, okay, now we're going, and we ran out of Egypt, and we ran for some days until we reached the Red Sea. And there we camped by the sea, and we began to imagine, is it possible? Is it possible that we are free? And then, of course, what happens is Pharaoh changes his mind for the last time. And out of the hills come the chariots of Pharaoh to bring death upon all the Israelites. So the Israelites, all of us, we cried out to Moses, were there not enough graves in Egypt that you brought us to die here in the wilderness? And Moses said, stand back and watch. And he held his arm across the sea, and the sea split, and we crossed in safety to the other side. And on the other side, he held his arm again, and Pharaoh's chariots are drowned in the waters of the Red Sea. And then the most remarkable thing happens. We turned around, and we looked out at the vast expanse of the wilderness, and we breathed that first breath as free people. And we began to sing, Michamocha Bailim Adonai. That moment, Jewish hope is born. At that moment, our sense of what the world is born, because at that moment, something remarkable happens to us. We can see the hand of God in history. We can see that hope has a basis, that it's not simply a vain, superficial, wishful thinking. We can see that it's possible for history to become somewhat rational, somewhat moral, rather than the bitterness and humiliation of slavery. I mean, just consider for a moment that in the book of Genesis, water represents chaos. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was unformed and void, says Genesis, and the Ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim, the Spirit of God, the presence of God hovers over the water. Water represents uncreated chaos. And what does God do after creating light on day one? On day two, God opens up the water and allows dry land to surface. And on dry land, God creates cosmos. God creates an ordered natural world. Genesis is about creating cosmos, ordered natural world, a world where the patterns of nature are predictable. And because the patterns of nature are predictable, we can create a meaningful way of life in that world of nature. The patterns of nature apply uniformly and universally. Gravity is always going to happen. It's not just 99%, it always happens. You wouldn't want to live in a universe where gravity only worked 99% of the time. That'd be scary. But to live in a world of ordered natural phenomena allows us to live with some degree of predictability and control. And as we learn science and gain the powers of technology, we can control the phenomenon of nature. I don't know how many of you have been vaccinated, but just think of the miracle of that, right? To have learned what it is that's making us sick, to have learned the qualities of that thing, and then to learn how to defeat it, how to create a barrier, a shield, so that you can walk the world now and actually take off your mask, hug your kids, have dinner with friends, and maybe one day even come back to the synagogue, go to a ball game, go to a movie. That's an ordered universe. That's what happens in Genesis. Well, in Exodus, it's a parallel story. Once again, water splits. But here it's not the water of nature, not the chaos of nature, it's the chaos of history. And what represents the chaos of history best? Slavery. One human being owning another, a human being turned from a dignified creation of God, a creature who bears a spark of divinity, created in the image of God, turned into chattel, turned into objects. So what does the splitting of the sea represent? It represents the creation of a moral order in the world, or at least the possibility of a moral order in the world. And that's what we learned at the other side of the Red Sea. And that's the last reading of the Torah that we do on Passover. And then Passover ends, and we all go order pizza. And then right here in the week, a few days right after Passover, we have two events that represent two days of commemoration, 1 week apart, that represent the two most profound moments of the 20th century for the Jewish people. But I'm going to argue not just the 20th century, but in some very real way, and I know this is arrogant to say because we're so close to it, but in some very real way, the two most profound moments in the history of the Jewish people. I mean, just consider for a moment. The greatest act of destruction ever experienced by the Jewish people was the destruction of the Holy Temple of Jerusalem in the year 70 at the hands of the Romans. The Holocaust matches it in its horror and in its disruption of history, matches it or exceeds it. And the greatest moment of redemption in all of Jewish history, the greatest moment of salvation in all of Jewish history was the Exodus from Egypt. And the recreation of the state of Israel, our reestablishment of a sovereign state, and what it's been able to do for the Jewish people, matches it or exceeds it. The difference is, of course, that Yitziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, and Churban Abayit, the destruction of the Holy Temple of Jerusalem, took place 1,500 years apart. The Holocaust and the creation of the state of Israel took place in the experience of one generation. One generation. How the hell do you make sense of that? What can you say about these two events? And they take place in the light of this Passover that has just ended. So this week we have Yom HaShoah on Wednesday night and Thursday, and next week we have Yom Ha'atzmaut on Wednesday night and Thursday, and just last Shabbos and Sunday was Passover. How do you make sense of this? Can you talk about a God of history? But how can you talk about a God of history if you've just commemorated an event which is as disturbing, as brutal, as despair-laden as Auschwitz, as the Holocaust? And then how can you not talk about a God of history if you just experienced the most remarkable and unlikely miracle of the recreation state of Israel? And this is the dilemma that we face. These two events, so remarkably powerful, and yet so difficult to reconcile one with the other. And what makes it even more difficult, is that we don't have the interpretive tools that were available to our ancestors. Our ancestors had a simple way, not a simple way, but a powerful way to understand tragedy. When the temple was destroyed, when the Jews were exiled from a land, from Spain, from England, from France, when a pogrom would come, when a riot would come, what did they say? They said, this is God's punishment. This is God's punishment. We were a sinful people. And the Bible says very clearly, the book of Deuteronomy repeats it again and again and again and again. You do mitzvahs, you receive reward. You sin against God, you receive punishment. You receive punishment. And our ancestors were able to assimilate and to, it sounds neurotic, of course, to say that the Roman Empire destroyed the Holy Temple because Jews sinned, but that's the way our ancestors understood it. And as neurotic as it is, I mean, who dares call Jews neurotic? But as neurotic as it is, at least it gave them a sense of the meaning of their tragedy. That their tragedy had a cosmic meaning, that they could see a divine plan in their lives, and they could assimilate these catastrophes to that sense of divine plan. But we are post-Enlightenment Jews. We are Jews of modernity. And we have, by and large, left behind those interpretive tools. When we look at an event, we don't see the hand of God. We see socioeconomic factors. We see politics. We see the movement of trade, the invention of technological innovations. That's how we interpret our history. So we're not ready to say there's some supernatural plan at work in our history. And yet, then what do you make of these? How do you learn from these events? So this becomes the dilemma. First, it's the juxtaposition of Passover, Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Memorial Day, and Yom HaAtzmaut, the Day of Israel's independence. And secondly, it's the whole question of, is there a God of history? Our ancestors thought they saw a God of history on the other side of the Red Sea when they breathed free as free people for the first time. But can we see ourselves as subject to a God of history, a God who has a stake in our existence, a God who is at work to protect our people, a God who has a plan for the ultimate redemption of the Jewish people? That's the question for tonight. Can you believe in a God after the Holocaust? Now, you recall a couple of weeks ago when we started our conversations, I made the suggestion that everybody has religion because I define religion as a map. All of us have a map. We have a map of the world that we keep in our heads. Most of us are not conscious of the map that we have, but all of us have one. And it tells us where happiness is and where peace is and what is expected of us as people and what are our values and what matters most and how to navigate the world and who's on our side and who's not on our side. And what it helps us navigate the world. So even if we remove the theology from the question, even if we're not interested in talking about God anymore, how does an event as brutally evil as the Auschwitz concentration camp, how does that affect your map? What does it do to your map? How does it change you? And just step back for just another moment. The question is going to be, what story do we tell? I think it's so interesting that on the Seder plate that we had in front of us last week when we made Seder, here we told a story of our slavery and our liberation, but there was only one portion of maror, one portion of bitterness on the Seder plate. The other things all had to do with liberation and freedom. That Passover isn't an obsession with the enslavement of the Israelites. That's part of the story, but that's only the beginning of the story. At the beginning of the Seder, we all said, Halachma anya de'achlu avatana de'ara de Mitzrayim. This is the flat, tasteless bread our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Matzah at the beginning is the taste of bitterness, the taste of slavery. But at the end, what does matzah become? The food of the liberated. The bread we had to smuggle out of Egypt because we were running so fast we didn't have time to order a pizza. The maror at the beginning of the Seder is the mortar we used to build Pharaoh's pyramids and monuments. And what is it at the end of the Seder? The sweetness that mellows the bitterness of the maror, the haroset. The haroset is the mortar, and at the end it mellows the sweetness of the maror. The greens, dipped in the tears of our ancestors, also represent the beginning of springtime, the possibility of new life that is represented by the springtime outside. All of the symbols of the Seder are paradoxical in that way. They have two meanings, because we were slaves in the land of Egypt and now we are free. But the freedom overshadows the slavery. The freedom is what the story is pushing us toward. The freedom is what we celebrate. It's not a sad holiday. It's a hopeful holiday. It's about the birth of hope out of the despair of slavery. Well, what do we do with the Holocaust when there was no hope, when there was no plague that came from heaven, when there was no miraculous splitting of the sea? How do we maintain a sense of hope? Where is hope on our map once we stare into the brutality of the Shoah? That's the question. That's the question I want to take some time tonight to ask you. And what I wanted to show tonight, I want to introduce you to a group of fellow travelers, some colleagues, some wonderful, wonderful teachers who have meditated and debated and taught about this for the last generation. Okay, let's do that first. Put this up on the screen so all of you can see this. The first teacher I'd like to introduce you to is a man named Richard Rubenstein. Richard Rubenstein graduated the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1945 along with Rabbi Harold Schulweis. 1950, along with Schulweis. They were classmates at JTS. And then Rubenstein went to be the Hillel director at Northwestern University. And when he was there, he finished a PhD in philosophy and became a philosophy professor in Florida, and then ultimately the president of the University of Bridgeport in Connecticut. In 1966, Rubenstein writes a startling piece. It's a book, but it's really one article in that book that's so startling, that becomes the watchword for this whole question. That is, Rubenstein offers us what's not so much a philosophical tract, but a scream, an absolute scream of pain. Here's what he writes. I believe the greatest single challenge to modern Judaism arises out of the question of God and the death camps. How can Jews believe in an omnipotent, that's all powerful, beneficent, that's all good, God after Auschwitz? The question he's asking us is, how come your Judaism didn't change? How could you go through the Holocaust and say the same prayers, celebrate the same holidays, embrace the same traditions, read the same books as you did before the Holocaust, as if it didn't happen? How come this doesn't shake you up? And this is a scream of protest. Traditional Jewish theology maintains that God is the ultimate omnipotent actor in the historical drama. Traditional Jewish theology has interpreted every major catastrophe in Jewish history as God's punishment of a sinful Israel. The prophet Jeremiah called Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian emperor, my servant. The prophet said, my servant Nebuchadnezzar is coming to punish a sinful Israel. The rabbis talked about the punishment of a sinful Israel, the destruction of the Second Temple. Traditional Jewish theology says we are being punished. If we're suffering, we are being punished for our sins. There's a line in the prayer book that we say on festivals, Mipnei chataenu galinu me'artzenu. Because of our sins, we were exiled from our land. That's traditional Jewish theology. That's how traditional Jewish theology absorbed catastrophe. Again, might sound neurotic. That it wasn't Ferdinand and Isabel who threw us out of Spain. It was our own sins that made that happen. That it wasn't the brutality of the Crusaders that destroyed the Jewish communities of the Rhineland in the 10th century. It was our own sinfulness. That it wasn't the brutality of the Cossacks in the 17th, 18th century. That was our own sinfulness. Yes, that may be neurotic, except It gave an interpretive framework that at least let Jews believe that their suffering had some purpose, that their suffering was part of a redemptive drama. But here, Rubenstein weighs in. He says, I fail to see how this position can be maintained without regarding Hitler and the SS as instruments of God's will. Jeremiah said Nebuchadnezzar is God's rod to punish a sinful Israel. Are you willing to say that Hitler was God's punishment for a sinful Israel? Rubenstein says, I can't believe that. To see any purpose in the death camps, the traditional believer is forced to regard the most demonic, anti-human explosion in all history as a meaningful expression of God's purposes. The idea is simply too obscene for me to accept. I can't believe that. So what he's done in that paragraph is just explode all of traditional Jewish theology. So then the question is there a God of history? And where is the God of history? And what does it mean to have a Passover? Now he takes a slight detour because one of his heroes is Albert Camus. And Camus refused to see man as inevitably, escapably guilty before God. Camus accepts the tragedy, the inevitability, the gratuitous absurdity of suffering, but he refuses to consent to its justice. I'm not going to believe that God sent this as a punishment. Yes, I suffer, and it's brutal that I suffer, but I would rather suffer because it's absurd than to see that God sort of sent this because I deserved it. Right? When you think about like what's the worst thing you can say to someone who's suffering, the very worst thing you can say to somebody who's suffering is you deserve it. Because that you've just doubled their suffering. And not only suffer, they suffer. Now they suffer and they know they deserve the suffering. Camus would rather live in an absurd and different cosmos in which men suffer and die meaninglessly, but still retain a measure of integrity, tragic integrity, than to see every last human event encased in a pitiless framework of meaning, which deprives men even the consolation of suffering, though inevitable, is not entirely merited or earned. We concur with this choice of an absurd and ultimately tragic cosmos. I'd rather live in a world with no God at all and no sense of meaning and just a tragic cosmos than to accept the fact that somehow God sent Hitler. But he says, I have one more thing, because he's still a rabbi. So you say, how can he be a rabbi if that's what he just said? It is precisely because human existence is tragic, ultimately hopeless, and without meaning that we treasure our religious community. It is a community of ultimate concern. In it, we can and share in a depth of dimension which no secular institution can match. We've turned away from the God of history to share the tragic fatalities of the God of nature. Rubenstein says, I'd rather live in a world that's meaningless, dark, and cold, but not have to acknowledge that we did anything to deserve something as brutal as the Shoah, and not to think of a God who would send that to us, because what kind of God would that be anyway? And he says, that's where I once asked Rabbi Schulweis something about this, because Schulweis and Rubenstein actually stayed close. And I said to Schulweis, do you agree with them? And Schulweis said, I agree. We'll see this at the end. He says, I agree that we have to change our theology. He's right. But I can't tell people, I refuse to tell people that there's no hope. I refuse to tell people that the world is dark and cold and meaningless. He said, he joked to me, he said, Rubenstein can say that because he's a college professor. And a college professor can tell undergraduates anything he wants. I'm a rabbi. My job is to bring people hope. My job is to help people through the tragedies and exigencies, trials and ordeals of life and give them a hope. How can you take hope away from people? And that's going to be the problem with Rubenstein. But Rubenstein, I think, sets out the challenge as clearly and as powerfully and as emotionally as anybody. Let's take a look at two responses to Rubenstein now. Two wonderful thinkers, one you all know and one you may or may not know. The first one you all know is Elie Wiesel. You know, Wiesel goes to Auschwitz. Wiesel is a Hungarian Jew, town of Szeged. He's evacuated to Auschwitz and he's 15 years old. And when the war is over, he writes his memoir. It's a really remarkable book called Night. If you've never read it, go get it for Wednesday night and read it. It's brutal, but it's magnificent. And it started out, by the way, at 700 pages, and he cut it down to 103 because he realized that in the end, it's what you don't say that's more powerful than what you do. Too many words mitigate. So this is part of his response, part of his memoir of the years he spent at Auschwitz. Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, which has turned my life into one long night, 7 times cursed and 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget the smoke. Never shall I forget the little faces of children whose bodies I saw wreaths of smoke beneath the silent blue sky. Never shall I forget those flames which consume my faith forever. Never shall I forget the nocturnal silence which deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments which murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to dust. Never shall I forget these things, even if I am condemned to live as long as God himself. Never. A brutal, brutal response of a witness to the worst of the worst of the worst that happens on this planet. But now watch what happens some years later. 1978, he publishes a reflection called A Jew Today. Now, in between what happens to Wiesel, he's liberated, comes to France, settles in Paris. He gets married. He has a child. His son Alicia is in the world today. And as a father and as a teacher, becomes a professor at Boston University. He changes his mind. And listen to what a later, older, wiser, maybe mellowed Wiesel thinks now. He says in 1978, our people has lost many of its children. We are alone, terribly alone, and sad, terribly sad. We are entering in even more difficult times. The era ahead of us will be critical. And yet, and I love that phrase, and yet. It's a Talmudic phrase, right? That's one truth, but here's the bigger truth. And yet, we owe it to our past not to lose hope. Contrast that with what he just said in Night. Say what you will, despair is not the solution. Not for us, quite the contrary. We must show our children that in spite of everything, we keep our faith in ourselves and even in mankind, though mankind may not be worthy of such faith. We must persuade our children and theirs that 3,000 years of history must not be permitted to end with an act of despair on our part. To despair now would be a blasphemy, a profanation. Where does he get that hope? I think a lot of it comes from looking into the eyes of his child and realizing that to take away hope in some way is to capitulate to the death that he experienced in Auschwitz. And that hope in a certain way is resistance. Hope in a certain way is protest. Hope in a certain way is to embrace life against the powers of death. And that is an answer. But now that hope is a very different hope. It's not a hope that's born of wishful thinking. It's not a hope that's born of a redemptive future. He doesn't know that yet. But I'm not willing to give up hope. The other figure that I want to learn, and I want you to understand that I think Emil Fackenheim takes Wiesel one more step. Emil Fackenheim is a German Jew. He was born in Germany, educated in Germany, and he's taken to the concentration camp as a young man. He was in Sachsenhausen, and then he was in, I think he was in Belsen. And he's liberated by the Americans. Ends up in Canada, takes a PhD in philosophy, and then he becomes a philosopher. In 1968, he publishes a piece in Commentary magazine in which he reflects on his experience in the Holocaust and asks the question, how can we have faith? So here are just a couple selections of what he says. The Holocaust challenges Jewish faith from within. But the negativism of its challenge is total, without light or relief. The more you look into the Holocaust, the more you study it, the more you encounter it, the darker and darker and darker it becomes. After the events associated with the name Auschwitz, everything is shaken, nothing is safe. And then he says, I want to point out something, he says, which is amazing to me. He says, I always took for granted that Jewish people would survive. But now I don't take that for granted at all. I don't take for granted the fact that Jews have decided after the Holocaust not to die. Now remember, in 1967, there is an event. I don't know how many of you were there and remember this. In the lead up to the Six-Day War in 1967, there was a palpable sense in our world, in the Jewish world, that the Holocaust was returning again. As Nasser gathered his forces at the Suez Canal, as the armies of Syria and Iraq and Jordan gathered on the borders of Israel, as Abba even pleaded with the United Nations not to let this happen, there was a palpable, a tangible, a really real sense that another 6 million Jews could be slaughtered, because that's what Nasser promised, that he would push us into the sea. And then 6 days of war, and immediately there is this remarkable sense of redemption. Now, what happened after that redemption was quite remarkable. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that up until 1967, the Jewish world basically, generally, typically closed its eyes to the Holocaust. We weren't really ready to assimilate it. But something happened in 1967 because it was a redemptive event, because it was an event of salvation, being saved. Suddenly we were able to confront the Holocaust. Just to give you a sense that it was only after 1967 that every community in America builds a Holocaust museum and a Holocaust monument. That didn't happen before. It was only after 1967 that Holocaust survivors start talking about their stories. Yes, there were some films and there was some background, but it really is after 67. And Emil Fackenheim is responding to this in 1968, and he says, I do not take for granted the fact that Jews still choose to be Jewish. I don't take that for granted. But I learned something from it. And here's what he learned. Here's what he learned, right? Let's go right here. Right? To be a Jew after Auschwitz is to have wrested hope for the Jew and for the world from the abyss of total despair. In the words of the speaker at a recent gathering of Bergen-Belsen survivors, which include him, the survivors, the Jew after Auschwitz has a second Shema Yisrael. No second Auschwitz, no second Belsen, no second Buchenwald anywhere in the world for anyone. What accounts for this commitment to Jewish existence when there might have been, and by every rule of human logic should have been, a terrified and demoralizing flight from Jewish existence? Just to give you an example of it, how many of you remember Madeleine Albright? Remember Madeleine Albright? Who was Madeleine Albright? Madeleine Albright was the Secretary of State under Clinton, I think in the first administration. Remember her story? Madeleine Albright grew up in America. Her parents were academics. Her father was a professor, came from Czechoslovakia. And in the first couple of weeks of Madeleine Albright's tenure as Secretary of State, she made an announcement that she suddenly realized that she was Jewish. Why? Because her parents hid it from her. Because there were Jewish refugees who came from Europe and didn't want their children raised as Jews. Why? Because it was too dangerous. It was dangerous to be a Jew. That's what they learned from their experience in Europe. So here is Fackenheim. And Fackenheim says the fact that so many of you are willing to come out of the closet and declare your Jewishness after the Holocaust tells me something. The ultimate question is, where was God at Auschwitz? And listen to Fackenheim's answer. Most assuredly, no redeeming voice is heard from Auschwitz. There's no redemption there, or ever will be heard. However, a commanding voice is being heard and has, however faintly, been heard from the start. Fackenheim sees in Auschwitz, or hears from Auschwitz, a commanding voice of God. Or rather, it's not that he hears it from Auschwitz. He says the Jewish people hears it. The Jewish people hears it. Because what did the Jewish people do after the Holocaust? We started building. We built schools and synagogues and summer camps and seminaries. We built all the institutions of the state of Israel. This explosion of a desire to live and to assert ourselves as Jews. Fackenheim says that is a response to something that comes out of the darkness. And what is it that comes out of the darkness? Listen to his words. They're quite profound. At Auschwitz, Jews came face to face with absolute evil. They were and still are singled out by it. But in the midst of it, they hear an absolute commandment. Jews are forbidden to grant posthumous victories to Hitler. They are commanded to survive as Jews, lest the Jewish people perish. They're commanded to remember the victims of Auschwitz, lest their memory perish. They're forbidden to despair of man and his world and escape into cynicism or otherworldliness, lest they cooperate in delivering the world over to the forces of Auschwitz. And finally, they are forbidden to despair of the God of Israel. I mean, it's just amazing. You can't give up on God. Why? Because that's what Hitler tried to do. He tried to kill the God of Israel. Why is Yom HaShoah celebrated this week? Because this was the beginning of the end of the Warsaw Ghetto. The Nazis invaded the Warsaw Ghetto for the last time, Erev Pesach. Now, why did they use Erev Pesach? Of all the days they could have invaded the Warsaw Ghetto, why? Because they were not just trying to kill the Jews who lived there. They were trying to say, we are more powerful than the God of Israel. That the God of Israel's gone, and the Nazi eagle, the Nazi swastika, is now the symbol that will rule the world. And Fackenheim comes and says, don't cooperate. Figure out a way to embrace the God of Israel. A secularist Jew cannot make himself believe by a mere act of will, nor can he be commanded to, yet he can perform the commandment of Auschwitz. I don't know how, but he can. And a religious Jew who has stayed with God may be forced into new and revolutionary relationships with God. One possibility, however, is wholly unthinkable. A Jew may not respond to Hitler's attempt to destroy Judaism by cooperating in its destruction. In ancient times, the unthinkable sin was idolatry. Today, it is to respond to Hitler by doing his work. So Fackenheim and Wiesel both say to us, this needs to change everything. But one fact of our existence cannot ever change. We can't give up hope. We can't give up faith. We can't give up identity. That's not permitted. Now, within the boundaries of that, go figure out what you're going to believe from now on, what you're going to learn from this event now on. Go figure out what kind of theology you're going to hold on to. And it's an act of resistance. It's an act of pushing back. That's where Fackenheim and Wiesel come down. Let's take a look at two other thinkers. Yitz Greenberg is an old friend of ours. He's been to Valley Beth Shalom many, many times. He's a wonderful, wonderful teacher. When Rabbi Shoah turned 80 in 2005, we had a convocation in his behalf. And Yitz came to speak, along with a number of other wonderful scholars. And this was part of the talk that he gave that night. He said, how can we talk about God again after such an event, the Holocaust? My answer is you can't talk about God. You can only recreate the image of God. That's a really interesting idea. He says, basically, we're not able to do theology anymore. It's not about philosophizing. It's about acting. And acting in the world in such a way that instead of talking about what I believe, I want you to embody the God that should be in the world. If you can recreate the image of God, that is a statement of God's presence. After the Shoah, the Jewish people didn't talk about God. What they did was recreate the image of God. Now just think about what he means by that, right? What does God do in the Bible? God redeems the Jewish people. What did we do? We created a state of Israel that went to work redeeming the Jewish people. It redeemed Jews from Arab lands. It redeemed Jews from Yemen. It redeemed Jews from Ethiopia. It redeemed Jews from the former Soviet Union. What does God do? What does God do in the world? God teaches us to look upon each other as brothers and sisters in a human family. What did we do here in America? We sponsored a liberal democracy, and we fought for civil rights for African Americans and for LGBTQ people and for the rights of women to stand up and have dignity in the culture. I mean, think about what we did. We took over the functions of God and we embodied them. We may not be able to believe in God. Jews may have a hard time articulating a belief in God. but they accepted the responsibilities of living with God. And that, says Greenberg, that's enough. But he goes one more step. He said the next step for the Jewish people is to take power. And listen to this statement. It's just extraordinary. And he's an Orthodox rabbi. I believe that God was saying, I am not going to save you. This is Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is the mystical belief in divine limitation. I'm asking you to stop the Holocaust. You, human, you're the partner in the covenant. Take responsibility. Taking power is the fundamental transformation of our religion now. We can no longer be a religion that says God will save you. God's own message is that you have to take responsibility. If there were ever a time God was going to intervene miraculously, it was during the Holocaust. So if God didn't do so then, he must have intended for us to take responsibility. The Jewish people overwhelmingly understood that. And that's why they all together embraced Zionism. That's why the Reform movement that had rejected Zionism for so many centuries, for so many decades, embraced Zionism after the Six-Day War. That's why the Orthodox, except for the very crazy ultra-Orthodox, the Orthodox embraced Zionism. That's why the establishment of the State of Israel became such a turning point for us, because it represented the Jews' return to power, because power is the one thing we lacked at that moment. And that's Greenberg's idea, that it's not that Israel in some way is a tshuva for the Holocaust, but that Israel is creating a state, embracing the state, supporting the state, and dealing with the ethics of power is now the response. That's now the response to a world which would do this to us. That's Greenberg. And what I think is really interesting is this notion that if I can't believe in a God out there who intervenes in a history, I'm going to turn it inward. And I'm going to see that human responsibility, human moral action now becomes a revelation of divinity in the world. The other thinker, and it's not an accident, they were close, the other thinker who articulated this was Harold Schulweis. I mean, Rabbi Schulweis, in his broader theology, talks about God as expressed in godliness, in the actions that we take as human beings to articulate and to act out in the world actions that bring tikkun, that bring wholeness to the world. But when it comes to the Holocaust, Schulweis had a remarkable response. Some of you remember what this response was. And it was unique and it was precious and it's so very interesting. 1965, Harold Schulweis is a rabbi of Beth Abraham Congregation, Oakland, California. And he attends a Jewish Federation dinner at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco. And Fairmont Hotel was owned by a Jewish philanthropist named Benjamin Swig. And in the middle of the dinner, Mr. Swig comes over to the rabbi and says, I want you to meet somebody. Come with me. And Schulweis gets up from the table and he goes and he meets a gentleman, a very large gentleman, wearing a coverall, like a maintenance man's coverall. And he introduces him to Herman Fritz Graebe. And he says, Mr. Graebe, tell the rabbi who you are. And Graebe begins to tell the rabbi the story. Herman Graebe was born in Germany. He was actually a member of the Nazi Party. And he was a construction contractor, had a very big, successful construction company. And when the Nazis began to invade Eastern Europe, Graebe's company was engaged to build defense installations on the Eastern Front for the Nazis. And it's there that Graebe witnessed the destruction of some of the ghettos of Eastern Europe. He saw what the Nazis were doing to Jews in Eastern Europe, and it sickened him because he was a German patriot, because he believed in the cultural advancement of the German people, and he couldn't believe that Germans would do such a thing. So Graebe, out of this experience, felt somehow called. And he realized that he was in a unique position because the Nazis had contracted with him to build these installations. He went back to the Nazi commanders and said he wanted Jewish slave labor. And they gave him permission to take Jews off of trains and out of ghettos and out of concentration camps. And he started recruiting all of these Jews. This is before Schindler's List. And by the end of the war, Herman Fritz Graebe had 5,500 Jews on his payroll. which means the Nazis wouldn't touch them, which means he saved 5,500 Jewish souls. And the rabbi's listening to this story, and he says to them, you saved 5,500 Jews after the Holocaust? And Graeber says, I guess so. And the rabbi said, what did we ever do to say thank you? And he said, I want to thank you. Well, what happened was, of course, is that at the end of the war, the Nazis caught on and they pursued him. So he crossed the lines and gave himself up to the Americans. And the Americans protected him. And after the war, they put him up as a witness at the Nuremberg trials. And after the Nuremberg trials, his neighbors told him that he was a traitor and they tried to burn his house down. So Graeber came to America. And when Benjamin Swig met him, he made him the maintenance supervisor of the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco. Shoah discovers Christian rescuers and then Muslim rescuers. Now, why is that important? Because Rabbi Schulweis maintains that in all places and in all moments of history, the possibility of moral transcendence exists. That's what Rabbi Schulweis meant when he says we believe in God. To say I believe in God means it's possible to transcend my interests, my needs, my desires, and to do something good for the world, to do something good for other people. He had to prove that. And how do you prove that? Well, if I can show you the very, very worst moral condition, the worst moral condition in the world, and yet I can show you people who transcended their own needs, who risked their own lives, who risked the lives of their families, who risked everything to save Jews solely because it was the right thing to do, then I can honestly tell you that God exists even in the Holocaust, not in the concentration camps, but in the moral courage of Fritz Graeber and Oskar Schindler and Sempo Sugihara and Jupp Westerwald and Raoul Wallenberg and 50,000 others who risked their lives and their fortunes to save Jews during the Shoah. And in that sense, I could say that moral courage exists, that hope exists, and that the possibilities of making a world whole exist. And that is enough to maintain a belief in godliness for Rabbi Schulweis. Again, what he does is similar to what Rabbi Greenberg did. He interjects it into human responsibility. I can't believe anymore in a God out there who reaches into history. The Holocaust prevents me from doing that. If the Enlightenment didn't take that away from me, the Holocaust certainly did. But I can believe that there is something transcendent in the world and something sacred in the world, because I've met a man who saved 5,500 Jews simply because it was the right thing to do. I can believe in moral transcendence. I can believe in the power of a miracle in that sense, because I've seen acts of human responsibility and human moral courage that go well beyond what anything we would call normal. And that's where Rabbi Schulweis comes down on this idea. One last point, and then we're going to stop. The exodus from Egypt takes place 1500 BCE, 1300 BCE. The rabbis of our Talmud are the ones who put together our Seder. They lived in around the year zero. It took 1,500 years for the Jewish people to figure out what the Exodus meant, enough to create the Seder that you and I celebrated last week, what the lessons were, what the rituals ought to be, and what we wanted to tell our children. I mean, again and again, the Bible says you will tell your kids, because of what God did for me when I came out of Egypt. But it was the rabbis who really interpreted that and gave us a ritual to do it and gave us the meaning of what God means, what it means to say, God, what God did for me when I came out of Egypt. We are still living in the presence of witnesses to the Holocaust. There's still survivors among us. But in the next generation or so, in the next decade or so, I suspect that most of them will be gone. And we will have to do what our ancestors did to the Exodus. We'll have to decide what story we're going to tell. What story are we going to tell? And the problem that Rabbi Schulweis wrestles with, the problem that Professor Fackenheim wrestled with, and I think it's ultimately the problem that Mr. Wiesel, a blessed memory, with what they all wrestled with was This story of Auschwitz, this story of Holocaust is so dark, so ugly, so obscenely evil that if you give it, if we just present it to the world, present it to our children without any possibility of light, we can destroy them. We can certainly destroy their hope, and from their hope, we can destroy their sense of responsibility. We can destroy their identity as Jews. We can destroy everything. It's too brutal. It's just too brutal to look at. I mean, it's like looking into the sun. It'll turn you blind. It's too brutal. All of them were looking, how can I use this in some way to rekindle hope? To not lose what we learned on the other side of the Red Sea, that there's still hope for a world, that there's still hope for humanity, that there's still a sense of responsibility that is built on that hope, that there's still a sense of faith in the possibilities of redeeming the world, that it's based on that responsibility. How do I reinforce that? And how do I prevent a Holocaust from stealing that away from our children and turning us either, as Fackenheim said, cynical, or otherworldly, or worse, selfish and cruel and oppressive? And that was the way that they understood the question. And from that question come their answers. Let's stop here. I got lots more to say, but I think it would be nice to stop here for a moment. Let me put this back on gallery view and take off the, remove the spotlight. Let's talk for a few minutes before we conclude tonight, because this was a heavy thing to talk about. Anyone have a question, a comment they'd like to share? And anyone on Facebook, I can read your comments. So if you want to put it in the comment box of the Facebook, or if anyone here on the chat, or just wave a hand and we can talk a moment. Or if I put you all to sleep, this is wonderful. Anyone waving a hand? My God, I think I have put the whole congregation to sleep. What a wonderful thing to have done. All right, so I'm going to leave you with a challenge because it's time to finish. So here's the challenge, okay? I want you to sit at an imaginary table with an imaginary group of young people, whether they're your children or grandchildren or friends or students, and they're going to ask you, you lived in the generation that followed Auschwitz. What is the story you're going to tell us about that? And what are the lessons you're going to draw from that? And how do you understand a belief in God? Or if not a belief in God, how do you draw your own personal map of the world, given the radical evil that the Jewish people were subject to in the presence of evil in Auschwitz? What will you say to them? What will you say to them? How will you answer that question? That is, the young kid asked us last week, Manishtana halayla hazeh mikol halaylot. Why is tonight different from all other nights? Imagine a generation from now, a young person is going to ask you, given the events of the 20th century that you were born in and you lived in and you experienced, Manishtana halayla hazeh mikol halaylot. How will you answer that question? Next week, on Tuesday night, I want to take the other question, which is, and how do we understand the rebirth of the state of Israel from a religious standpoint? What does Israel change in us that's different from what we had before? Thank you all for listening. Take very, very good care. Tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, I'm going to be interviewing Karen Perlmutter about the film she's just created and the book she wrote about her father's story, Abraham Perlmutter, and how he was saved from the Nazis. Shabbos, of course, we have Torah study and then davening on Shabbos morning. We're coming back to the shul. In April, we're going to have services in person. So please look out for the announcements of that. Please be careful. If you can get the vaccine, go get the vaccine. Wear your mask, keep the distancing. Let's all get healthy and come back together. God willing, we'll be back together soon. Stay well, everyone. Have a very, very good night.